be seated. I want to invite you this evening to open in your Old Testament to Exodus chapter 17, at least as a beginning place for tonight. In our study, we're going to talk a little bit about something that took place after the Israelites had crossed the Red Sea, after they had been delivered from bondage in Egypt. They had been traveling in the desert for really just a little while, not too long in the whole scheme of things, when they were met with their first opposition. It was a group of people known as the Amalekites. And in Exodus chapter 17, in verse 8, we're told there that Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. And so Moses said to Joshua, "Choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." And so Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and they put it under him, and he sat on it while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. And so his hands were steady until the going down of the sun, and Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. And then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this as a memorial in a book, and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar, and he called the name of it, "The Lord is my banner," saying, "A hand upon the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." And so the Amalekites were distant cousins of the Israelites. Amalek was the grandson of Esau, Jacob's brother. He was the son of Eliphaz, who was the oldest son of Esau, we learn in Genesis chapter 36. And we know from what is said in Scripture that, there was some tension between Jacob and Esau. We read about that. But we also find that there was hostility between their descendants as well. That hostility continued down through the generations. And so the Amalekites bore great hatred for the Israelites. And it seems that hatred had only grown and it had festered for hundreds of years while Israel was in Egypt. And when they came out of Egypt, there is almost immediate conflict. And so as the Israelites, as they journeyed through the wilderness, the Amalekites began to ambush some of them. It was those who were, lagging towards the back of this giant group of people who had come out of Egypt. In Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verses 17 and 18, as they're looking back on that situation, Moses says, "Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you. And he did not fear God." That was the problem. And I suspect that the thinking of the Amalekites was, we're not going to have much trouble here. I mean, these are a bunch of recently released slaves. They've been journeying through the desert. Really easy picking, so to speak. And so this was a desperate time for the Israelites. I mean, they're trying to march through the desert. They've never been on a journey like this before. And the people are growing weary, and the Amalekites are attacking them. And they're cutting off the wheat from among them. And the Israelites certainly didn't have much in the way of military experience. They'd been slaves for generations, not fighters. And they couldn't rely on such things. The only thing they could rely on was God. And so I want you to imagine for a moment that you are Joshua in this situation. And Moses calls you and he says, "Joshua, I've got a plan. I want you to choose some men, and I want you to go out and fight the Amalekites tomorrow. And I'm going to stand on top of that hill over there with a stick in my hand." That's basically what he tells him. Does that sound like a great plan to you? From a worldly perspective, it doesn't, does it? But I want you to see that this was no ordinary stick that Moses held. It was the staff that God had been using ever since the burning bush back in Exodus chapter 4. It was the staff that became a snake and ate all the snakes of Pharaoh's magicians. It was the staff that touched the Nile and turned it to blood. It was the staff that was lifted up as the Red Sea was divided. It was the staff that struck the rock from which water poured forth. And so this was the staff that Moses held up while the people went into battle. And the Israelites couldn't prevail solely by their own strength. As a bunch of recently released slaves, they couldn't defeat a group of warriors who'd come out for battle. But when that staff was raised, that group of former slaves was victorious. And the power, of course, was not in the staff, as you know already. The power was in the God behind the staff. And so Israel won a great victory that day. They had won a great victory, and Moses says in verse 15, or it says of him in verse 15, that Moses built an altar, and he called the name of it, "The Lord is my banner." A banner, in the sense that the word's being used here, is a standard or a rallying point around which people draw together. And there would be different purposes for that in the ancient world. It would be for some kind of common action or as a centralized location for important information to be imparted. People would rally together around a banner, again, for a variety of reasons, but one of the most important of those was the gathering of troops for war. And so Moses was saying that the Lord was the point around which the people gathered in order to engage in this battle. And the Bible points out that the journey of the Israelites to the Promised Land, at least in some ways, is comparable to our journey as Christians. And we even sing songs at times that would indicate as much. And what I want us to see this evening is that our text points out that we're not going to experience defeat in this endeavor and what God has given us to do as long as we march under the standard of God, if the Lord is our banner. And I think that's an important lesson for us to understand as the people of God. And so I want us to talk just a little bit about some things that are related to that in our lesson this evening. And as we begin, I want to apply 3 principles from this passage to our situation as those whose home is not in this world, those who are strangers here, aliens here. It talks about pilgrims, some translations will say, people who are looking forward to the Promised Land. And of course, these are not new principles, but they're principles that are worth repeating. And so the first of those that I want you to see is that we can't experience salvation without experiencing warfare. We have to fight for it. And before we get too far into talking about that, I do think we need to point out and need to be quick to point out that we're not talking here about earning our salvation or something along those lines. That's not what I mean when I say that we have to fight for it. That work of salvation, the work of freeing slaves, so to speak, is God's work. We would never have been able to free ourselves from our own sins, just as the Israelites would never have been able to free themselves from the bondage that they experienced in Egypt. That was God's doing. And so there was nothing that we could do to bring about deliverance. God alone can deliver people from bondage. Moses made that point just prior to the Israelites crossing the Red Sea back in Exodus chapter 14. He would say there in verse 13, he would say to the Israelites, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again." God's going to take care of that. And so their salvation was from God, no question. And the scriptures compare the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt to our own salvation. And we can make the same point with regard to our salvation as well. God saved us. He set us free. There was nothing that could have been done that would have brought about our deliverance from sin except for the saving work of God on our behalf. Salvation is God's work, plain and simple. And yet, if there's one thing we can learn from our text, it's that the redeemed life is not a life free from either work or war. It's just not how that goes. It's not as if those who are saved by God sit back and they do nothing. They just kind of wait for the Lord to bring everything to completion. It seems to me that there are a lot of people in our world today who don't understand that. And so, that we haven't been set free to sit back and do as we please and just kind of enjoy life until God sort of wraps everything up. We've been set free to stand up and fight. And it's interesting that shortly after the Israelites are delivered by God from their bondage in Egypt, that they are confronted with the Amalekites. And when they're confronted with these hostile people, God didn't have the Israelites all set up on the hill while he took care of them. He had the Israelites engage them in battle. They had to fight. And I recognize when we begin to talk about how things are for us, Paul would say in Ephesians 6 and verse 12, that our struggle is not against flesh and blood. It's not a fleshly battle that we're engaged in. But there are plenty of passages in the Bible, including the one from Ephesians there in Ephesians 6, that tell us that to be a Christian is also to be a soldier in the Lord's army. That's true of anybody who is a Christian. And so that's why Paul would say to Timothy, for example, in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 12, he'd say, fight the good fight of the faith. Or he would say in Ephesians 6 and verse 11, put on the whole armor of God. Because the devil would love nothing more than to come along and to take out the weak and to take out the weary. And that's why God encourages us to put on the armor and to take a stand, because we're going to face the enemy. It's just a reality we have to come to terms with. And so we're going to be engaged in a battle. But the second thing that I want you to see is that we can't afford to rely on our own strength as we go into this battle. You see, the enemy we face is much too powerful for us. Too powerful for us to face on our own, that is. And so the Israelites learned that lesson the hard way, really not long after their experience with the Amalekites. If you recall, Israel ended up wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, we're told. And that wasn't the Lord's original plan for them. That's not what he wanted for them. Moses, after a period of time, they go to Sinai and they spend about a year there. Then they start making their way to the promised land. And as they get on the very edge of things, Moses would lead people right up to the border of the land of Canaan. And they would send in spies from each of the 12 tribes, and they would go into the land and they would spy it out. When they came back in Numbers chapter 13 and verse 31, we're told that 10 of those 12 spies said this: we're not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. Okay. And so the people of Israel gave in to the spiritual cowardice of the 10 spies, and the Lord was angry with them as a result of that. And that's when he sentenced the Israelites to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And obviously that was a discouragement to them. The Israelites didn't like that news. They didn't want to hear that. They didn't like the consequences of their actions. And so they'd had enough of the wilderness experience and the time they'd already spent there. And they weren't interested in staying there any longer. And so the day after Moses had told them the bad news, it says in Numbers 14 and verse 40, they rose early in the morning and they went up to the heights of the hill country, saying, here we are. We will go up to the place that the Lord has promised, for we have sinned. Yep, we made a mistake, but we're ready now. They had changed their minds. But so had God. And so Moses tried to warn them, but it didn't matter. They tried to start taking the land on their own strength, and they were defeated. And so we read in Numbers 14, and beginning in verse 41, that Moses said, why now are you transgressing the command of the Lord when that will not succeed? Do not go up, for the Lord is not among you, lest you be struck down before your enemies. For they're the Amalekites, there's our people again, and the Canaanites are facing you, and you shall fall by the sword. Because you have turned back from following the Lord will not be with you. But they presumed to go up to the heights of the hill country, although neither the ark of the covenant of the Lord nor Moses departed out of the camp. And then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and defeated them and pursued them even to Hormah, it says. And this story is a perfect illustration of the fact that we can't expect to go into battle alone and win the victory. That's not going to happen. We don't have the strength to do that on our own. And that's why Paul, back in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 10, before he even mentioned putting on the whole armor of God, would say to the Ephesians, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. That's where our strength needs to come from. It's foolish to go into battle relying on your own strength rather than God's. It will not work. But I also want you to see that if we rely upon the strength that comes from God, we can't be defeated. Have we come to understand that God wants his people to be victorious? And that he wants to give us the victory? That we can even be confident that the victory is ours if the Lord is our banner, to borrow the language from our text? that we don't have to run and we don't have to surrender, that God never meant for his people to do that. Some people have pointed out that when Paul gave the list of the individual pieces of armor in Ephesians chapter 6, that he doesn't list any armor, for the backside of the soldier. And the conclusion that some have reached by that is because God never intended for his people to turn around and run. Now, I'm just going to go and tell you, that is reading way more into the scriptures than it is anything else. That's a lot of reading into it. But I will say this, God never intended for us to flee. He never intended for us to run away. I don't believe he intends for his army to turn and run. He intends for his army to stand and fight, to advance by the strength that he supplies. And that doesn't mean that the battle won't ever get fierce, and it's not to say that there won't ever be any casualties, but it does affirm that the one who is for us is greater than the one who is against us. If the Lord is on our side, we don't have to worry about who's going to win the victory, because the victory belongs to God. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, do we really believe that? Do we believe that we can't be defeated if the Lord is our strength? Is there anything we can point to in our lives as we look back, as we look at what goes on and say, the only way I can explain this victory over this evil is because God is at work in my life? I bet all of us have times that we can look at that and say that. Sometimes it seems to me that we don't necessarily believe it like we should. And the reason I say that is because we sometimes choose to stay in the camp rather than go into battle. We're sometimes hesitant to enter the battle, aren't we? And the problem may be that we either don't understand how serious the war is in which we are engaged, or we don't trust the strength of our God. I can't think of a third reason why we would do that. Do we truly believe that what the Lord has revealed about himself? Do we believe that we can't be defeated if he is our strength? We need to understand, we need to firmly believe each of these truths we've been talking about. But I want us to spend the rest of our time this evening talking about how important it is for us to rally around the Lord our banner. Again, to borrow the language from our text that we read a little bit earlier. And I want us to notice three things about what it means for the Lord to be our banner. And the first thing that I want you to see is that it means that we declare our allegiance. That's what we're doing when we say that. Each of us is called upon to make the Lord the point around which we rally. As I said earlier, that's one of the purposes of a banner or a standard or an ensign. Different words describe the same thing. And so we're called upon to ask ourselves in light of this, where does my allegiance lie? You ever notice that, we begin to take it out of the serious and put it in the not so serious? You ever notice that fans of sports teams, they wear their team colors and they wear their team logos, and they do that with pride. Unless they're Dallas Cowboy fans this year, then they don't really do that. I made that up just on the spot. I'm sorry about that. Have you ever noticed how vocal some people can be about their favorite team, and yet how silent they can be about their God? Can people see where your allegiance lies as you live from day to day? I'm not saying get a t-shirt or something like that. That's not the point. I'm saying about the things that we do and the things that we say. Do people see where our allegiance lies? Jesus would say in Luke chapter 14 and verse 26, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Our allegiance is to Jesus. We're not living the way we ought to. And so our allegiance is declared when we say that the Lord is our banner. But second, if the Lord is our banner, it also means we define our adversaries as well. So let me say a word or two about banners or standards or whatever you want to call them. One reason banners were so important, and really they were that way really all the way up through the Middle Ages, was because they identified which side you were on. Armies didn't always say, you guys wear red and we'll wear blue and we'll come and fight. That's not how it always worked. At some points in history it worked that way. But for the most part, people just came together and fight in whatever they wear. And so they knew which people they were fighting against, in part by which banner they fought under. And if we choose to line up on the Lord's side, then we can expect to set ourselves up as somebody's enemy. That's just how that is. You ever notice that when you begin to talk about the Lord, or you begin to talk about what is right or wrong, that some people immediately take a different attitude towards you? And that's a good example of what I'm talking about here. When the standard is raised, some people begin to see you as the enemy. And that's why those who decide to follow the Lord have to decide that they're ready to have some enemies, because there will be some. Your enemies will be defined when you give your allegiance to the Lord. And then the third thing, if we rally around the Lord as our banner, it means that we define our associates as well. I don't think the Lord ever intended for us to fight the battle alone. Not even just us and him together. I mean, that's enough. But I don't think he even meant just for that to be the case. The Lord's will is that we fight and that we do that side by side. And so when you look at our text back in Exodus, Moses, he wasn't by himself. He had people there to help him. And as we, we have to ask the question, are we as quick? Are we as quick to join each other in the thick of the battle as they were? When we're under attack, who is it who's going to come, who's going to hold up our hands, so to speak? Or maybe the better question is, when others are under attack, are we going to be at their side to hold up their hands? The point I'm trying to make is that we need to be there for one another. That's part of God's plan. And it may be that one of the best ways that you and I can do that is for us to pray for one another. It's interesting to me that when Paul in Ephesians chapter 6, after talking about the full armor of God and putting it on and the strength that comes from God and all those things, he would encourage his readers in chapter 6 and verse 18 by saying, he told them to be praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. And then he said in verse 18, to that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints. It's interesting that he brings that up. After talking about putting on the whole armor of God and relying upon his strength. Do you think that's a coincidence that he would do that? I don't. What that says is that goes together. So there may be times when, we go back and we read from the Old Testament and we wonder, are there any lessons for us to learn in the particular stories that we read? And we know that there are. The Apostle Paul would say in Romans 15 and verse 4 that whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction. We're meant to get something out of it. There are lessons there for us in these stories that we read about from the Old Testament, things that happened hundreds of years ago in completely different parts of the world, in cultures that really just are strange to us. We don't get how they many times did things, but there are principles that apply. These things were recorded for us, those of us who live under the new covenant. And so we can learn from God's people in times past. But the question for us is this: will we choose to do so? Will we learn the lessons that God is trying to teach us? May he help us to do that. Because while our battle doesn't look a whole lot like that of the Israelites as they faced the Amalekites or anybody else they came into conflict with, our battle is very real all the same. And the principles that applied to them, they apply to us. We're not getting through this without God's strength. That we're not getting through this without relying and benefiting from the help of one another. That God's plan for the victory of his people is the same, whether you're talking about Israelites coming out of Egypt or God's people living in this world. So let's learn the lessons. Let's have the Lord be our banner, the standard around which we rally, the place where our allegiance lies. Yes, it may define our enemies, but it defines our associates as well. So let's be there. Let's be there for one another. If you are here tonight and you owe some duty to God, whatever that might be, maybe you've never obeyed the gospel of Christ. If not, why not tonight? And if there is something else that maybe you owe, maybe you've obeyed the gospel, but there's something else that you need to make right in your life. Maybe you've not given the kind of allegiance to God that you need to give to him. Maybe you've not been the kind of soldier in the Lord's army that you know you ought to be. And so if there is some way in which we can help you this evening, we ask that you come as we stand and as we sing. Come to Jesus.